Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar today. We'll get started here in about a minute. Okay, it's the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to session 3 of this land management practitioner webinar series. Today, we're going to talk about how cheatgrass control can promote biodiversity, wildlife habitat, and carbon sequestration. Really, the idea behind this session was that we know that not everybody can attend all of the scientific meetings throughout the season due to budget constraints or travel constraints, such as Western Society of Weed Science, NASMA. And we therefore wanted to just bring this new research, these new peer-reviewed publications that these authors have recently published out to you guys as land managers. We find it very important, some really cool findings. So we really appreciate. Oh, sounds like they can't hear us. Okay, sounds like we're good on the audio. Well, thank you for that. Okay, perfect. We'll keep on rolling. So today we have a great lineup of speakers from throughout the West. We have Jake Corkamp from CSU, Kurt Smith from University of Wyoming, Lisa Jones from the University of Idaho, and then Toby Maxwell with Oregon State University. Please submit your questions throughout the webinar in the chat, and we'll have a Q&A session at the very end of this webinar. This will also be recorded as well. You'll get the link at the end of the webinar, and you'll be able to share that. You'll be able to view it at a later date if you wanted to share that with anybody else as well. So just a quick overview. I wanted to just introduce kind of the why behind why we're here, right? The invasive grasses, like we know, are the #1 threat and the #1 invasive weed in the Western US in terms of degrading the sagebrush biome in our Western ecosystems. And what we're seeing is that these larger, more frequent wildfires throughout the West. This is an example, 2024, over 850,000 acres burned just in Wyoming alone, which is degrading that wildlife, pollinator, habitat, that ecosystem diversity that we'll talk more about today. And I've been involved with many projects throughout the West. I'm the government stewardship manager for NView Range and Pasture. And what we're finding is that when we remove invasive grasses, when we can prioritize sites that still have that remnant native understory, we're able to see all the benefits that come back by defending our core, defending the core that we have, this habitat that still has the chance of restoring and having success with these restoration projects. So with that, I'm going to kick things off to Dr. Toby Maxwell, and he's going to talk about carbon sequestration and some of the interesting findings that they had in their paper. It's all yours, Toby.
All right. Thanks, Derek. Let me share my slides here. How's that look?
Good to go.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the invite and also appreciate the many people's time here. So jump right into it. So I'm going to talk to you about carbon storage and how annual grasses are understood now to deplete sagebrush steppe carbon stocks, but new data that actually is not yet published, so this is kind of not even yet hot off the press, we're showing that restoration can help recover it. So I'm going to start a little bit big picture, especially as I'm the first speaker here. So one question I often get asked is why carbon in drylands? These are ecosystems that aren't particularly productive. We think of carbon and carbon sequestration. We often get directed to think about forests, but importantly, there's hundreds of millions of acres of drylands in the Western US and Canada, and it's one of the major ecosystem types globally by land area. So there's a lot of land area, so that means that small changes across a large area can have a potentially large impact. And also, because these areas are not particularly productive, there's actually a high potential for soils to store more carbon. So these soils you could almost think about as a dry sponge with a high potential to start absorbing carbon. And in particular in the Western United States, this is a great opportunity because these large landscapes are managed by relatively few entities. Of course, there's many different management units, private, state, county, all sorts of different jurisdictions as well. But we have some land swaths that are subject, for example, to in the Bureau of Land Management, one authority that covers, tens or hundreds of millions of acres, depending on how you look at it. And so there's an opportunity to work with these agencies to actually start to think about how to make sort of change in policy and how we manage these areas that can trickle down. And then another important thing is that carbon is not just carbon. It's not just for the sake of this atmospheric CO2 concern that many people have, but it's actually a really important part of an ecosystem. So carbon in the soil is important for drought resilience of native plants. And so we see areas that have more carbon having greater resilience, greater water holding capacity. And so there's this co-benefit of carbon to an ecosystem. So just to put that kind of last idea into some graphical terms, you can see here this plot is showing the start of some kind of improved soil management that might affect surface carbon. So that on the bottom here, we have a time axis, and on the top, we've got this soil quality improvement. And what falls out from an improvement in near surface soil carbon is we get better soil structure, which is aggregation, and that leads to better water infiltration, better water and nutrient holding capacity, better water and air quality, productivity of the ecosystem. And some of our data is also showing that carbon can then also be linked to better survival of outplantings that are put out for restoration. So carbon is, of course, of interest for this atmospheric problem, but it also has a lot of important downstream effects that can affect restoration and ecosystem resilience for a long time. So I want to think a little bit about why carbon in particular with respect to sagebrush steppe. And so, as many of you may know, the annual grass fire cycle is threatening the sagebrush steppe. And as Derek highlighted, that's the major threat to about 70% of the degradation occurring in this ecosystem. And so you can see here this kind of cartoon characterization of that cycle, whereby the native ecosystem made up of shrubs and bunch grasses that you can see on the left-hand side has always experienced fire, but now when it's experiencing fire under the pressure of introduction of annual grasses, we get this selection for grass that leads to increased fire frequency, and that fire return interval goes from maybe 50 to as much as 300 years down to sometimes annually, or about 1 to 5 year return interval on average in these annual dominated systems, which simply doesn't leave enough time for the native perennials to reestablish. So how does this relate to carbon? Well, if you take a look at these different kind of, again, cartoon representations of different parts of this ecosystem, you can start to see some differences. So on the left here is that native ecosystem intact, as we would call it, with the shrub and bunch grasses. And we see a good amount of carbon represented by the darkness of this soil profile. You can see here this gradient in color. Well, in this invaded area where you might see an annual grass coming in, you might actually see a little bit of increase in carbon in the topsoil because of increase in plant cover. But what that leads to is the start of this grass fire cycle that I was showing you in the last slide. And if you have enough perennials, you might be able to retain some of that carbon, as you can see in this third panel. But commonly, am I still in here? My
Yeah, I
screen
got you,
seems to have
Toby.
screwed up.
Yeah, I just stopped sharing if you want to maybe reshare. You there, Toby? I think he's frozen. All right, we'll circle back with Toby. Lisa, are you good?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, let's kick off. Let's roll into your talk, Lisa, if that works.
Okay.
And then we'll circle back with Toby.
Sure. Well, yeah. Switching gears here. Hopefully, we'll get back to Toby's talk. That was sounding really good. Today, I will be discussing an article that was recently published in Restoration Ecology, and it's a project looking at indaziflam for cheatgrass control and how it increased native species richness for up to 8 years in the Colorado Front Range. And I'd like to start by acknowledging my co-authors listed here. They put in a lot of work to get this publication out. So to begin, we know that with any pesticide or really any management action for that matter, there can be positive or negative non-target impacts that can happen. And so this table here summarizes what we know about indaziflam, and there's some conflicting reports. I know it's a lot on the screen, but what I mainly want to highlight here is that you see there are some reports showing increases to our desirable plants, and then there are other reports showing decreases to our desirable plants. And then there are also other publications that show no non-target impact from indaziflam use. So in the case of indaziflam, restoration managers must consider potential trade-offs in plant community composition when contemplating using indaziflam for annual grass control. This project took place in Boulder County, which is highlighted on the map here. And we had 12 locations that are managed by the Boulder County Parks and Open Spaces. These 12 sites varied in elevation from about 5,500 to 6,700 feet. On average, they received 18 inches of annual precipitation, but they also varied in their soil types, their aspects, land use histories, and the plant communities present at the time of application. However, all these locations had cheatgrass present for at least 20 years. One aspect that I think is unique about these locations is that the Colorado Natural Heritage Program ranked them as having outstanding or very high biodiversity, which are the two highest levels of biodiversity that can be achieved. Herbicide applications were made just one time at each location. They were made post-emergent of cheatgrass in December 2016 through February 2019. So not all 12 locations got the herbicide application in the same year. The locations were added over this 3-year time period. And the herbicides used was Rejuva at 7 ounces per acre plus Roundup at 12 ounces per acre applied with the tractor. And then at each location, we had paired, adjacent, treated, and non-treated plots. And the size of the plots varied kind of just based on the landscape conditions, so anywhere from 2.5 to 80 acres. Data was collected March through November of 2016 through 2024, so that's 8 years. And what they did was collected presence data by species of native plants in a 15-foot wide belt transect. Now, the length of that transect varied depending on the location. So generally, the areas that had a larger area treated would have a longer belt transect. One aspect that I think is unique of their data collection is that they went out 9 to 12 times per year in order to capture all the species that emerged. And then once per year in November, they estimated the cover of cheatgrass in both the treated and non-treated plots. This data was analyzed with a generalized linear mixed model, looking at the factors of treatment, so whether it received the herbicide treatment or not, summer after treatment, which you'll see abbreviated SAT, so the kind of time point, the treatment by SAT interaction, and then random effects of location and location treatment. Now, this data was looked at for 1 to 8 summers after treatment. So we have data on cheatgrass cover native species richness, and those native species were subdivided into growth forms. So we have information for forbs, shrubs, grasses, sedges, and also short-lived species. And then also looking at proportional species level occurrences. And by that, I mean, out of the 12 locations, in how many locations was a certain species observed? So getting right into our results here, looking at cheatgrass cover. We have cheatgrass cover on the y-axis and our summer after treatment increasing from left to right. Now this is averaged for all 12 locations. And we see the non-treated plots shown in green and the value for our treated plots in this teal color. So across these 8 years, the cheatgrass cover in our non-treated plots was 37 to 77%. Our cover in the treated plots was only 1 to 6%. So this equates to a weed control of 89 to 99% for these 8 years. While I really like this graph in showing the difference between cover of cheatgrass and our treated and non-treated, I really love showing this photograph. This photograph was taken 2 summers after treatment, and you can see the non-treated on the left with all that tan senesced vegetation is primarily cheatgrass, and here is the treated plot right adjacent to it on the right, showing very little cheatgrass. Now, this graphic shows species richness averaged across all locations and time points, and for different life form groupings showed across the x-axis. And so for all life forms listed, we see that there was more species found in our treated plots relative to the non-treated plots. And this percent number at the top of the bar shows the relative increase for that life form group in the treated versus non-treated. And we see the biggest increases were from the forbs and our short-lived species. Now, this is a more nuanced figure showing richness by the plant functional group over time. So now we have our summer after treatment increasing from left to right, and our different species functional groups listed on the right here. So from this graph, there's a few patterns that I want to point out. First, we see that there was greater richness in our treated plots versus our non-treated plots for every life form grouping and at pretty much every time point. Second, we see that richness in the treated plots continued to increase over time, which for the most part we do not see happening in our non-treated plots. Third, these red boxes are highlighting the life forms and time points at which point the species richness in the treated plots was more than double of our non-treated plots. So thinking about let's look at the all species category. If we had stopped our monitoring before 6 years, we wouldn't have seen this large increase. So this highlights that longer monitoring can give better detail of our management impacts. And lastly, the groups of all species, forbs, and our short-lived species, they also show richness increasing over time more so in their treated versus non-treated plots. And by that, I mean, think about if you drew a line connecting the top of these teal bars, you see this is going to be a steeper slope for those growth forms than the other ones, for the non-treated. So in this case, we conclude that indaziflam did not reduce desirable species richness, as can be a concern for managers. In fact, in this case, indaziflam appears to have increased native species diversity. I want to talk a little bit about the short-lived species, because these are the ones that are typically considered most vulnerable to indaziflam. And I want to focus on this graphic on the right. I know there's a lot going on, but just to kind of overview it, we have the list of 53 short-lived species, all native, that were observed throughout all locations. And we have the first column is from our non-treated plots. Our second column here is from our treated plots, and it's from left to right, increasing summer after treatment. And these are color-coded so that if the species was observed in very few locations, it's colored yellow, and if it was observed in all locations, it's colored blue. And I hope you can see, even just eyeballing this graphic, that the set of treated plots here has more green and blue colors than in our non-treated plots. So this is in contrast to other people's findings of indaziflam having negative impact, especially to our annual forb species. We think that the species gain in our treated plots suggests there was likely an existing diverse native seed bank and that cheatgrass control allowed for their emergence. And it could be that these species are absent in the non-treated plots because they are poor competitors against cheatgrass. And then for 2024, which is the last year we have data that represents 6 to 8 summers after treatment, overall we saw 61% greater richness of our short-lived species in our treated plots versus our non-treated plots. So how are these gains possible? All these functional groups at such increasing species richness? These are just some hypotheses. We did not test these directly, but we think that cheatgrass control increased resource availability for other species. And we suspect that the high level of control in the later years, up to 8 summers after treatment, was likely due to cheatgrass seed bank depletion, as the seed is suggested to only live up to 5 years. Second, we do not know much about native species tolerance to indaziflam. My co-authors have observed a handful of native annual forb species appear even the first growing season after indaziflam treatment, suggesting these species might be less susceptible to indaziflam. Also, much is unknown about native species seed longevity, location in the soil profile, and depth from which they can germinate and emerge. The gain of species could be from existing seeds located below the layer of indaziflam that now with the cheatgrass control have more resources available, and thus they could germinate and avoid contact with indaziflam. So to summarize our findings from this project, we saw that one application of Rejuva controlled treatgrass for 6 to 8 years. Now, indaziflam is estimated to only remain active for up to 4 years. So this high cheatgrass control later on is not from residual herbicide activity. Next, native species diversity consistently increased every year after treatment, regardless of the different initial species composition and the application dates. Long-term control stimulated plant establishment and increased diversity of all growth forms and long and short-lived species. And though I didn't mention it here, we also saw increases in our rare species. And lastly, these restored systems proved resistant to reinvasion. And what I mean by that is think back to the picture I showed of the side-by-side treated and non-treated plot. There are cheatgrass seeds mere feet away from that treated area, but even 8 years later, we're not seeing significant amounts of cheatgrass cover in the treated plots. So how can we apply these findings? First, I want to stress, do not expect these results everywhere. These locations are what I call less degraded, and that they historically hosted diverse plant communities. Even the non-treated plots still had supported many native species, so it's not insignificant. These findings can help you prioritize your restoration efforts to enhance invaded sites that have remnant native species. And this is where knowledge of your site's current and past conditions can inform you of its recovery potential and how you evaluate trade-offs with herbicide use. So if you have information like that, how the Colorado Natural Heritage Program provided about historical biodiversity, that can help with your prioritization. Next, long-term monitoring beyond 5 years can enhance your ability to evaluate lasting effects of management actions. Again, we saw some really cool patterns emerge beyond that 5-year time point, which if we had stopped our monitoring, we wouldn't have seen such big gains in our species richness. And lastly, I will take this opportunity to point out that I think we need more seed bank studies. Again, we think a lot of the native plants came in from the existing seed bank, but we really have a lot of questions still about those seed bank dynamics. So I'd like to see more work done on that. So thank you for your attention. I have the QR code up here, which will link directly to the article that I talked about. There's also a lot more data and results in the article that I wasn't able to discuss today. So I encourage you to check it out. And I'll take questions at the end of the webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Perfect. Great, Lisa. Thanks for the summary of that paper. Congrats on that publication. It's really interesting to see the longevity in data. Many projects they only have 2 to 3 years of data, but tracking that for over 8 or 6 to 8 growing seasons is impressive. So we'll switch gears back to Dr. Toby Maxwell, and he was getting into the nitty-gritty of his carbon paper. And Toby has his connection back up, and we'll be ready to rock. It's all yours, Toby.
Okay, thank you. All right, can we see and hear me?
Yep.
Thanks, folks, for your patience. Not sure what happened, so I'll just continue on here, try and be efficient given time. So yeah, essentially, I just wanted to convey that each of these different plant communities from left to right in various degrees of intact and unburned on the left and burned on the right. After wildfire, you often see these grasslands develop will have different predicted amounts of carbon in the soil. And so this is essentially where the theory got us and what we would expect out of these different plant communities. And we just wanted to emphasize that the reason for thinking about carbon in the soil in particular in these dryland ecosystems is that there's 10 to 70 times more carbon stocks in the soil than there is in the above ground biomass. And so here on the right, you can see this kind of gradient represented where these different plant communities have in the shrublands, maybe 10 times more carbon in the soil compared to the plants. And that can be up to 70 times as much in the soil in perennial grasslands. So before we started our research that I'll show recent results to you, we wanted to ask what is already known about this topic. So there's been lots of studies over time measuring carbon in soil of a number of different plant communities. And so looking at 3 different plant communities as contrast, a native sagebrush steppe community, an invaded with cheatgrass sagebrush steppe communities, and then annual grasslands dominated by cheatgrass. And what you can see over here in these plots is that in the surface soil, 0 to 10 centimeters with carbon represented on this y-axis and different bins here for how long it had been since a wildfire occurred on the x-axis, we're seeing not that many meaningful differences between these different plant communities that would be expected to have large differences based on their productivity, whether they're perennial or not, and how deep their roots should be growing. You can see again down here in the deep soils, these letters are conveying statistical differences, and we see no statistically significant differences among these community types in the deep soil, which was perplexing because we'd think that these long-lived, deep-rooted perennial communities should have more carbon deep in the soil than a shallow-rooted, ephemeral annual grass. And so one conclusion could be that there's no differences in the soil carbon. And another was that we needed to go back to the drawing board and do some studies that had better design for side-by-side comparison. So one way that people often break up these landscapes is by thinking about resistance and resilience classes. And so you can see here a map of all the different studies that had been done before ours, showing in varying degrees where the darkest color is low resistance and resilience. So that would be a hot, dry, essentially poor quality site. And as you get to a lighter color, you start to see higher resistance and resilience. And what we see here is that most of the data that was available was coming from these poor quality sites, meaning that we're getting a misrepresentation of the landscape based on just a literature search. So what this means is it calls for more research. And so this sort of meta-analysis investigation is summarized in this paper, which is now a few years old, which we determined that the effects of cheatgrass on Great Basin carbon depended on a number of different things, including plant community, the seasonality of precipitation, and the soil. So moving on from this, we wanted to overcome the limitations of the previous work and create a robust study that had good side-by-side comparisons. So to do so required matching site history, thinking about burning and wildfire as a driver of invasion. And so we needed to disentangle that wildfire effect from the invasion effect. Additionally, we accounted for what microsite heterogeneity. So anybody who's walked around in these communities knows that there's often a lot of bare soil, especially in, for example, Northern Great Basin, sagebrush steppe. And so And that amount of bare soil can vary pretty dramatically between different communities or even from, say, a north to a south aspect of a slope. And then last was making sure we had proper replication. Soil is a pain to study. It's highly variable. And so making a point to actually do the statistical calculations to make sure we were getting defensible data. And so this led to a publication and actually a collaboration with NView, which I'm very grateful for offering us the opportunity to go out and really drill down on the methods and do a very robust, in-depth study. And the headline to this recently published article, about a year ago now, I suppose, really says it all, that annual grass invasions and wildfire deplete ecosystem carbon storage by 50% to resistant base levels. So what does this look like? Well, going back to my cartoons here, you can see that from this native intact ecosystem, whether it's invasion, wildfire, or the combination of the two, as you can see in the plot on the right, each of these pathways of disturbance led to 50% loss of carbon storage in this ecosystem, which is quite profound. In particular, it was very interesting to us that burning and invasion combined didn't have a synergistic effect. Rather, they just had the same effect as each independent disturbance. So an important note here, though, is that when you talk about soil carbon, there's carbon quantity, which I've been discussing so far, and there's also carbon quality. And so many times it's when studies observe carbon, they're looking at all of the carbon put together. And if you make some simple differentiations in what type of carbon you're measuring, then you can actually start to see some more subtle differences. And this is important because a lot of the research that I was showing in earlier slides from that meta-analysis that looked at all the research that had been done on this topic, a lot of that research showed no difference between different plant communities. And what I'm about to show you helps to explain that. So there actually were likely differences occurring. It just wasn't in the total carbon pool. So here, a first differentiation is you can have organic carbon, basically plant material, or inorganic carbon. You might, if you've ever dug into a soil, you might hit a caliche layer, which is essentially just carbonate. It's a mineral carbon form. So if you distinguish into just organic carbon, you can start to see some differences then by fractionating that into what we call a particulate or a mineral associated carbon. We don't need to get too deep in the details of what these are, but basically particulate carbon is just poorly processed, loose, almost barely decomposed plant litter, and mineral carbon is carbon that is highly processed by soil microbial communities that might be stuck onto soil particles. And so this particulate carbon can be thought of as unstable and the mineral carbon as more stable carbon. So a few scenarios that we saw occur in this study, looking at the transition from just no wildfire here, just sagebrush to invaded sagebrush. In some cases, we actually saw more carbon in the invaded sagebrush communities. But as you can see on the right here, this MAOC, that is the stable carbon, and this POC, particulate, is unstable carbon. So the increases that we're seeing is due to this unstable carbon. So it's really not a sustainable or durable change. Well, when we saw no change in carbon, and when we looked at the total pools, we were actually seeing changes in the balance. There's sort of this decrease in this stable carbon on the left and this increase in unstable carbon on the right. So even though there's net zero difference, we're destabilizing that carbon pool. And then finally, in cases where we're losing carbon with this transformation, we were seeing that we're losing that carbon from the stable carbon pool. So in all these cases, we're seeing a shift towards less and less stable carbon, meaning that whether it's a wildfire or something else that comes through some type of other disturbance, this carbon is less likely to stay around. So this data is summarized in this recent publication earlier this year that looks at making these comparisons across a few different ecoregions, including Colorado and Wyoming. So a lot of what I've shown here is a little bit doom and gloom, and I do want to zoom out and think about this as an opportunity. And so We think of this landscape as vast, and the opportunities, as I was talking about in the beginning of my talk, are therefore also vast. And so I want to move forward to think about how can we understand how the ways that we're managing this landscape are affecting carbon. And so this is a map from 2017, which wasn't necessarily comprehensive, although it was an impressive effort. Shows how much of the land area of the Great Basin has received some kind of treatment, an exotic grass treatment. And so the question that we had was, how are these millions of acres that are being treated affecting carbon? So the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center gave us funding to ask exactly this question. You can see the blue stars here are this MVU funded studies looking at these transformations of cheatgrass invasion and wildfire that I've already been talking about. And these red stars here are now representing this new study looking at the potential carbon benefits of restoration across the North Central region. So covered a lot of degrees of latitude, a lot of climate space, and I'll just try and speed on through here. So slightly different comparison that we're making here, looking at an invaded community compared to a restored community. So in this case, invaded could be a cheatgrass annual grassland or a invaded shrubland. And on the right-hand side here, you can see a healthy perennial grassland or an uninvaded perennial shrubland. And then importantly, we weren't just looking at invaded versus restored, but also uninvaded versions of these native undisturbed sites that we can think of in a sense as a referee here. So we need to know how the original ecosystem was before any disturbance occurred to know how much change in carbon or how much carbon may have been restored to it, and if we were able to restore to the original level. So I'm going to show you a number of plots that are in log terms, and I don't want you to get bogged down in those details. So for that reason, I've created this kind of color scheme. So when you see on a plot an arrow that has a green end to a red end, that's indicating that a particular process is leading to more carbon or less carbon. And there will be a zero line in the middle indicating when a treatment may have led to no change in carbon. So first here, just looking at all of our data across about 30 sites across all these states from Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming. We see here in blue going forward is going to be the restoration response, so the restored areas compared to a reference state, and in red will be the invasion response, so invaded compared to a reference state. And across all the data, what we see is that there's this decrease in carbon in the invaded areas, and that when restoration is applied, we can bring that carbon nearly back up to that reference state and statistically indifferentiable. Okay, but it's important to note that there's a lot of complexity in this data. So this breaks down our data by different ecological regions and different sampling regions. And you can see here that in some areas, there might have been a greater response in the invaded area. In some areas, that's not true. In some areas, neither community type or neither invasion nor restoration really brought it back to that reference state. And so the point here is not to get into the details of each of these regions, but to point out that there is a very, at times, nuanced response to both invasion and restoration, and that what we're trying to do with some of this data and other ongoing studies is to try and understand exactly what it is that sort of cranks this lever so that restoration can be known as a force that can bring that carbon back to the ecosystem. So a few of those things we can look at right here. So first, we'll just look at exotic annual grass cover of the invaded site. So essentially what we're asking here is, does it matter how invaded a site is in terms of how much carbon is lost and in terms of the potential for that carbon to be regained by restoration? And so what we see here is when a site is more invaded, that there's a less and less of a potential to reach that reference state in terms of carbon after restoration. So the worse we let the invasion get, the less potential there is to recover that carbon. Now looking at this from another perspective, we're looking at total canopy cover, essentially the productivity of a site, and we're looking at that for the reference community. So basically asking, in the original state of a site, does the productivity of that site affect how much carbon is lost and how much can be recovered? And so what we see here, which makes sense, in the red line, it's indicating that more and more productive sites can lose more carbon. That makes sense. You have more, you stand to lose more. But the exciting thing is that we see the potential to recover carbon is relatively flat across all these sites. So regardless of how productive a site is, there's actually potential to recover all of the carbon. The last point I want to make here is a similar plot looking at perennial grass cover. So similarly, we're asking in the reference community, so the undisturbed state of a site, how do the perennial grasses affect carbon loss? And we see that when there's more perennial grasses in a site, we see less of a loss of carbon. So that means these perennial grasses are helping maintain carbon even when invasion is starting to occur. And importantly, again, we see a flat line for the restoration response, which is good in this case, meaning that regardless of the perennial grass cover, we can recover carbon. So even if you have a low perennial grass cover site, that doesn't mean that you can't necessarily regain carbon to a site. So this last bit isn't yet published, still working on this data set. There's a little bit more. We have more data coming in from Rocky Mountain National Park, which are our highest elevation sites. We're also looking at trying to understand wildfire and restoration interactions. So asking questions about how long has it been since a wildfire and how long has it been since restoration, and to see how those different factors affect recovery of carbon to a site. And then the last thing is at each of these sites, we looked at soil water infiltration and water holding capacity. So we really wanted to make sure to account for some of these other co-benefits that carbon is said to have and measure them. And so we'll be coming up with that data soon. So last but not least, I just want to thank the many people who made this possible. Matt Germino is the main co-author and a mentor of mine on this study, Bryn Lazarus and Jake Price, and then a number of other people who did the hard time in the field to make all this work possible. So I'll take questions at the end. Here's a few of the different publications. So if you want to look those up, feel free to email me, toby.maxwell@osucascades.edu. I'm happy to have a chat and answer any questions. And so thanks for your time and thanks for bearing with me with the technical difficulties.
Thanks, Toby. Great presentation, and good to see that we can still recover and restore some of this carbon or limit the losses that we're seeing out there in the field. We'll switch gears now. We're going to talk wildlife. We'll talk mule deer habitat, visitation. Dr. Curtis Smith, if you want to share your slides, we'll get you rocking, and then we'll have Dr. Jake Korkamp conclude with his mule deer paper as well.
Great, thanks, Derek. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, good to go.
Cool. Well, hopefully you can see my title slide now. I'll just confirm that before I begin.
Yep, we can see it.
Great. Still have difficulties with these virtual meetings, even though we've been doing them for years now. Anyways, thank you, everyone. Like has been said, I'm Kurt Smith. I'm a research scientist at the University of Wyoming, and I'm going to talk about deer response to invasive annual grasses with emphasis on strategic management efforts. So I'm going to talk a little bit at a higher level on some of the newer frameworks that have been put in place to look at invasive annuals at the ecosystem level. And quickly like to acknowledge collaborators on this work, Brian Mailer, who is a professor at the University of Wyoming. He wears many hats, but he's also the director of the Institute for Managing Annual Grass Invading Natural Ecosystems. I had to write that down, but that's the UW Imagine program. So they're really focused on this invasive issue. And then Jared Merkel, who's also a professor at the university, and he's currently the science advisor for the USDA Migratory Big Game Initiative. Okay, so not to repeat too much what has been said previously, but the sagebrush biome is large. It historically covered something like 63 million hectares. It's one of the less developed ecosystems in the world, and unfortunately, it faces numerous threats and it's highly imperiled. And as has been said, invasive annuals are one of the leading causes, accounting for nearly 70% of the loss of what was historically considered high quality sagebrush habitat. So a brief history of sagebrush and cheatgrass. In 1914, it was thought that cheatgrass was present in every state, and through time up until relatively recently, managers and people generally considered sagebrush as a nuisance. So as an example, in the 70s or by the 70s, nearly 2 million hectares of sagebrush on federally managed lands had received some sort of sagebrush control. And that was for the primary purpose of reducing sagebrush to increase forage productivity for livestock. But it wasn't until leading up to maybe 2010 when sagebrush was really brought to the forefront of American conservation, and that was when sage-grouse were petitioned for protection under the Endangered Species Act. So ramifications of a listing really galvanized partners across the West, and through policy change and conservation actions, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife determined that sage-grouse were no longer warranted for protection under the ESA. And this effort was considered one of the largest landscape level conservation efforts in U.S. history. So why am I talking about sage-grouse? We'll get to deer, I promise. But up until recently, these challenges to the sagebrush biome were largely framed as a species habitat issue. So the threat of an Endangered Species Act listing or declines of priority wildlife were really the avenues that brought the challenges of the sagebrush ecosystem to the policy forefront. But there's a complication of this species-centric framing, and one is that not all people living and working in sagebrush place high value on these charismatic wildlife. So approaching this problem from an ecosystem level has become the vision to really get as many stakeholders on board as possible. And recently, the sagebrush conservation design was developed to identify regions broadly that had high quality sagebrush habitats through several remotely sensed metrics to identify and prioritize sagebrush ecological integrity. And so through this, the sagebrush biome was really delineated into three main categories, being core habitats with high quality intact sagebrush that contain few threats, growth opportunity areas or sagebrush areas that could be high quality with some form of threat mitigation, and then other rangeland areas that either didn't have sagebrush or contained severe threats. And this strategy was designed to really provide a framework for implementing more of a proactive conservation approach. So instead of focusing on highly degraded sites that are unlikely to respond to management, focus has been placed on more preventative actions to retain the integrity of core sagebrush habitats. And recently, the sagebrush conservation design has been adapted to strategically prioritize invasive annual grass management efforts. And this framework, which I'll call the strategic invasive annual grass framework, identifies areas to maintain, or those areas that have high ecological integrity and currently have low invasion of annual grasses or low invasion potential, areas to improve, or areas that currently contain invasive annual grasses, but they could be restored with some form of management and intervention. And then areas identified to contain, which are severely degraded already, particularly with invasive annuals, and they're unlikely to respond to management intervention. Now, core sagebrush, of course, have declined over the past 20 years, and it's predicted to continue to decline under our current management strategies. These bar charts here represent the estimated total amount of conservation efforts in terms of hectares of habitat per year needed to offset the loss of core sagebrush in the light gray portions. And the current amount of yearly effort are shown in the darker colors. So for invasive annuals, only about 7% of yearly treatments are being placed in the right areas to offset losses to core sagebrush. So spatial prioritization is clearly needed to prevent further losses. However, the effectiveness of these strategies to simultaneously benefit wildlife, so an ecosystem down approach, so to speak, have for the most part not really been assessed. Okay, now to deer. Many western ungulates, including deer, of course, rely on sagebrush habitat for food and cover for at least parts of the year. And mule deer, as we know, have received a lot of conservation attention over the last several years and decades, largely due to population declines triggered by habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. And there have been substantial efforts to conserve critical deer habitat, but until recently, very little focus has been placed on improving mule deer habitat affected by invasive annual grasses. There are many reasons to be concerned. So there is some evidence that ungulates will seasonally consume invasive annual grasses, but they do generally contain lower nutritional quality compared to perennial native vegetation. They also tend to green up earlier and senesce more rapidly than native vegetation, which could potentially impact the ability of deer to track resources or surf the green wave, as I'm sure many on this webinar have heard about over the past several years. But probably the most concerning is that overall, any sufficient disturbances such as wildfire, for example, could trigger those annual grass wildfire cycles that could lead to a more permanent shift towards a invasive annual dominated vegetation community, which would generally lack the woody vegetation that mule deer depend on. So the objectives of our work were to get a better understanding of how mule deer select habitat in relation to invasive annual grass cover, and then to use those results to forecast how invasive annual management scenarios could impact mule deer habitat over the next 20 years. And I put our results in context with those strategic frameworks. So our study occurred in northeastern Wyoming near the towns of Buffalo and Casey, Wyoming. This is a mid-elevation sagebrush and sagebrush-associated grassland. Lots of invasives here, including cheatgrass and Japanese brome. Ventenata is also present in northern portions of the study area. This is primarily an area that's grazed by livestock, and there is some energy development in the area. And this picture is just slightly northeast of Buffalo, Wyoming, pretty characteristic of the region. There's also, like I say, lots of invasive annuals. This picture is taken along a partially reclaimed gas road in the study area, and you can see some cheatgrass in the foreground and throughout the background. So we used GPS location data to assess resource selection responses by deer, where we collared 115 adult females, the majority of which were captured in 2019, and deer were equipped with a store on board collar, which was programmed to collect a location every 2 hours through the end of November 2022. Big thanks to Wyoming Game and Fish and Hall Sawyer at West, who collected this data. Admittedly was initially not collected to look at grasses, invasive annuals, but we saw the opportunity and took advantage of the data set. To address our first objective, we developed standard resource selection models, or I might refer to them as RSFs throughout the rest of the talk, where we contrasted used and available locations within individual deer seasonal ranges. And we were primarily interested in how deer selected invasive annual cover, but we did include additional covariates to account for potential variation in selection based on other factors. I won't talk about this here, but to estimate annual cover, we used the range analysis platform dataset. And then to forecast, we developed validated models based on the RSF, where we simply predicted to a combined utilization distribution for all individuals and seasons. So we essentially restricted our predictions to those areas that deer were using in the study. To do our future forecasting, we used the summer model as a baseline to forecast 2 different scenarios to quantify how spatially targeted management could improve mule deer habitat in the future. And we did this by applying the RSF results, except that we generated predicted annual and perennial cover rasters for each scenario. And this approach assumes that the other environmental covariates do not change over that same 20-year time period. In our first scenario, we assumed that the rate of change in annual and perennial grasses was consistent with past trends. And here we used RAP data again to estimate per pixel changes from about 2002 to 2022 to generate new annual and perennial rasters 20 years from now. So basically we used past trends in what or how vegetation has been changing and applied that to see what that might look like in 20 years. In the second scenario, we simulated management across the study area in areas with invasive annual grass cover that's currently predicted to be greater than 15%. So in those areas, we assumed a perfect treatment response leading to 0 invasive annual cover. We also assumed that perennial cover would replace invasive annual cover removed by those treatments. And then in areas that are not targeted for treatment, we allowed annual and perennial cover to change similar to that no action scenario. So as you can see, these scenarios are relatively simple assumptions aimed at forecasting a very, very highly complex issue. And to quantify our scenarios, we simply calculated percent change in predicted values, predicted changes in how deer might select the landscape between future and current predictions. Okay, so for our resource selection results, during all seasons, we found evidence that deer selected invasive grasses in a nonlinear pattern. So here the relative probability of selection increased to approximately 10 to 14%, depending on season, after which selection declined and was lowest once invasive annuals reached approximately 20% cover. And just looking at the raw data, we see that less than 5% of all deer locations occurred in areas with greater than 20% invasive annual grass cover. So that really helps to corroborate our findings here with the model. With our future forecasting, under a no action scenario, if we do nothing, we're predicting that about 75% of the study area will contain annual or contain greater annual cover in 20 years compared to current conditions. And this spatial prediction is showing the percent change that we are predicting, with the warmer colors, especially red here, showing where we're seeing or predicting large declines in relative probability of selection by deer. And so due to these predicted increases in annual cover, about 60% of the study area is expected to see a large decline in predicted mule deer selection. The majority of that decline is expected to occur in those improved priority areas identified by the strategic invasive annual grass framework. So those areas are the ones that have been identified as areas that currently contain invasive annuals, but they could be restored with active intervention. Now, on the flip side, strategic management could drastically improve the outlook for deer in this region. It's currently about 200,000 hectares, or approximately 50% of the study area contains greater than 15% invasive annual cover. And with management, we could see about a 65% or 65% of the study area could increase in terms of habitat quality for deer, with the majority, again, expected to occur in those improved areas. So those areas that could be restored with active management. Okay, to summarize quickly, deer are avoiding areas with high invasive annual grass cover, and this certainly tracks with what we know about the nutritional quality and phenology of invasive annuals. And this potential threshold we're seeing in this nonlinear response corresponds with an approximate cover value at which vegetation communities may begin to shift towards invasive annual dominance, both with or without disturbance. So as I mentioned, these frameworks, the sagebrush conservation design, and then the strategic invasive annual grass frameworks have somewhat shifted conservation focus to prioritize areas that are most likely to respond to management actions. And fortunately, based on our initial assessment here, it is appearing that these strategies could also improve deer habitat that is at risk of invasive annual grass invasions. And just quickly wanted to discuss future direction because, as I mentioned, our work here is a bit of a thought exercise, and it would be really nice to validate our findings and really be able to determine how these actions truly are benefiting wildlife and deer in particular. So we have this opportunity. Unfortunately, though, it comes with some fire. So the house straw fire burned approximately 175,000 acres in August of 2024 in this region, and it's definitely adds some new challenges here. But in 2025, about 81,000 acres of treatments were conducted to reduce invasive annual cover, and I believe some more treatments are in the works for 2026. And treatments did overlap with some of the areas used by previously collared deer. So we're currently in the early phases of developing a new study to quantify changes in mule deer habitat use before and after these treatments. And so hopefully that'll help help us further understand how deer are both responding to these changing habitats and responding to management actions intended to improve their habitat. Thanks a lot for having me here. If anyone has any questions outside this webinar, it can be reached at ksmith94@uwyo.edu. And I think next up is Jake.
Perfect. Thanks, Kurt. And as Jake's getting that together, I found this fascinating study. We've been working in this, mule deer wildlife habitat realm for quite some time. And this is a really applied project that shows really if we don't do anything, we're going to lose significant acres of critical winter range, as well as these mule deer avoiding sites where invasive grasses are as little as 20% cover, which is pretty crazy because you think about every acre in the West that has 20% cover of an invasive grass, there's a lot of acres that fit that criteria. So now Jake's going to dive into, moving past some of the modeling to now actual habitat response and mule deer visitation that he's seen in some of his work. So we'll kick it off to you, Jake.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Just to confirm, you can hear me and you can see my title slide.
Yeah, you're good to go, Jake.
Okay. So thank you for coming, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the other presenters on the call. So my name is Jacob Korkamp. I'm a research scientist at Colorado State University. I'm in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship, and within that, I'm in the Restoration Ecology Lab. So I think I want to start by acknowledging my co-authors, Jim Sebastian and Joe Swanson from Boulder County Parks and Open Space. This is really their project. I just sort of polished it up and wrote it up and got everything collected together, and we were able to publish a paper last spring. So I have a citation for that on the final slide, but let's go ahead and get started, and I will bring us home. So a little background. A little background here. So mule deer is a complicated story. I'm a plant guy. Plants can't move, so they're a little easier to study. I'm sure Kurt has had similar experiences working with animals that can move around and confound your research designs in all of these different ways. But in general, it's thought that mule deer are declining from historic population peaks that occurred in the early 1900s. There are some habitat dynamics that you can get into there that are beyond the scope of this presentation, but essentially there's some speculation that historic livestock grazing may have eliminated a lot of the grasses and promoted shrubs. And so that increase in shrubs created the conditions for mule deer populations to grow very rapidly And then since that peak in the early 1900s, they've sort of been on this steady decline. Cheatgrass is one of many factors that has been linked to mule deer population declines. And one way that might happen is mule deer are primarily browsers, or you can think of them as concentrate selectors if you're familiar with the ungulate literature. And they focus their foraging on woody shrubs like bitterbrush and mountain mahogany, particularly during winter months. And a lack of winter forage has been linked to mule deer population declines. And so we think that that availability of winter forage is really a sort of a key limiting factor for mule deer populations. And so when you think about annual grasses and shrubs that are available for forage, it seems fairly obvious that annual grass invasion is likely one of these factors driving the decline. And that could be due to a loss of shrub habitat from wildfire, shrub establishment being prevented by invasive annual grass competition. So essentially new shrubs struggle to establish because of competition from those annual grasses, and also potentially reduced production of established shrubs. And so this is less clear, but it was really the focus of our project. So to what extent is the competition from cheatgrass limiting shrub production in a way that's going to limit the availability of forage for mule deer? And then to what extent can we reverse those impacts with effective annual grass management? So this is really the focus of our study. So annual grass invasion, right? It has obvious negative impacts on mule deer and mule deer habitat. But with these recent advancements in annual grass management, I'm thinking here about Rejuvra, we wanted to better understand to what extent that management, right, reverse or counteract those negative effects that are resulting from that cheatgrass competition. So our study took place at Hall Ranch in Boulder County. These may be some of the same sites that were included in the research that Lisa presented on. I'm not going to linger too much here. Hall Ranch is an open space in Boulder County. It's approximately 1,300 acres. It's managed for recreational use, and there is no hunting allowed. Our experimental design, we had 3 treatment areas and 3 adjacent untreated controls. So our treatment plots ranged from 2.4 to 6 hectares. They were treated with 7 ounces of Rejuvra mixed with 12 ounces per acre of Roundup, and those treatments were applied in December and January 2018. They were applied using a tractor with a fixed boom and flat fan nozzles, spraying approximately 114 liters per hectare of water carrier. So our research sites were subjectively located so that they would be similar in terms of slope, aspect, and they would support plant communities dominated by similar plants. So all of our research sites featured understories dominated by downy brome or cheatgrass prior to treatment. And you can see a picture of the general area of our study sites there on the right. So we did a couple things for our project. The first was vegetation measurements. So we measured the longest leader, so looking from the tip of the shrub leader to the bud scar, so essentially measuring that fresh growth less than 1 year old. We measured those shrub leaders in fall 2018 to 2021, which corresponds to 9, 21, 33, and 45 months after treatments were applied. And then we measured 2 different types of shrubs. So in 2 of our plots, antelope bitterbrush was the dominant shrub, and in another one, rubber rabbitbrush was the dominant shrub. And so both of these species are utilized by mule deer, but bitterbrush in particular is considered excellent forage. So just some background here. We've actually observed mule deer using both of these shrub communities at Hall Ranch. In particular, Jim Sebastian has observed this, and these seem like species that are certainly important and being utilized. To give you some context here in terms of why we decided to measure those longest leaders, shrubs typically store more than half their nitrogen and their non-structural carbohydrates, so those nutritious components. More than half of those are typically stored in leaders and leaves less than 1 year old. So we're kind of zeroing in on the part of the shrub that is most nutritious. And then we evaluated differences between treatment and control plots using paired t-tests. So that vegetation study was paired with a camera trap study. So a camera trap is just like a motion activated game camera. So we installed these cameras in spring 2021 in treatment and control plots. Again, we subjectively selected our study sites so that they were similar because the area covered by a single camera is much larger than the overall treatment or control plots. Across our three paired treatment and controls, our cameras ranged from 50 to 200 meters apart between those treatments and controls. The cameras were set to take 3 photos with a 1-minute interval between each 3-photo burst. And mule deer use was quantified by counting the number of deer observed actively foraging in the photos taken by each camera. So each triggering event was considered unique. So in that sequence of 3 photos that was attributed to a single triggering event, we only counted each individual deer 1 time. And then we summarized our data by month. So we essentially summarized our data into counts of foraging observations per month. And then we used ANOVA to evaluate differences between treatments and controls. And importantly, we analyzed those seasons independently because of interannual variation. So here are some pictures of our study sites. So you can see the controls on the left, the treatments on the right. I'm not going to linger here too much. These pictures were not all taken at the same time of year because I went through a whole bunch of pictures and tried to pick the ones that showed the most cheatgrass in the control plot. So it's probably difficult to see here, but if you look in those pictures in the control plots there on the left side, you'll see that cheatgrass understory. We didn't actually have cheatgrass data from these plots. So we're really just sort of relying on these photographs and anecdotal observations of cheatgrass in the plots to establish that we achieved very, very high levels of cheatgrass control. So now we'll get into some results. So what you're looking at here is the length of the longest shrub leader on average in our treatment and control plots. So treatments are shown in gray and controls are shown in white. And you can see that we saw much greater leader growth in our treatment plots. So we're looking at roughly a 50% increase in leader length after treatment. And importantly, that effect is maintained all the way out to 45 months after treatment, which was the latest we sampled in our study. So treatment consistently increased leader length in treatment plots for 4 consecutive years, likely increasing the availability of nutritious woody browse during winter months. So now looking at the data from our camera trap study, so that what you're seeing here is data from 2 different seasons. So you're seeing essentially winter 21-22 on the left side and winter 22-23 on the right side. And this is data representing the number of foraging observations. So that's what's along the y-axis there, the number of deer observed foraging summarized again by month. And so you can see in that first year, the treatments are shown with the dashed lines. You can see we have that really big peak in mule deer use in January, where we have very little use overall in the control plots. And we have a similar thing occurring in the second season, but that increase in mule deer use is more consistent across that winter season with less dramatic peaks. And that's sort of translated or evident in our statistical results. So you see on the left, we have significant fixed effects for treatment month and their interaction, whereas on the right in the second season, we're only seeing a significant effect of treatment. So the effects of treatment are more consistent across those months. So we asked a question, what is maybe driving these different patterns we're seeing in these different years? And so if you look at this peak in January 22 in that first season, Boulder County, the area where the study took place, received 280% of normal precipitation that January. So we had a very, very snowy January. And so it is potentially the case that the mule deer sort of focused their foraging in treatment areas during that period of very heavy snow where those longer shrub leaders might have been easier to access. So treatment increased mule deer foraging observations in treatment plots in 5 of the 6 months included in the analysis for both the winter 21-22 and winter 22-23 seasons, suggesting that mule deer may preferentially use treated areas during winter months. The last thing I want to talk about here, this is from a different study. So this last summer, we were working on a project where we sort of opportunistically evaluated potential differences in forage quality between treatments and controls. And so these are different sites, but definitely very similar and in the same area. And so you can see here, we evaluated crude protein at 3 different points in time in the summer. So early, mid, and late season, which corresponds to early July, mid-July, or early July, late July, and mid-September. And across the entire season, we saw an increase in crude protein. So importantly, this is a composite vegetation sample. So essentially, we're putting a frame on the ground and we are harvesting everything within that frame. So this is not specific to shrubs or grasses or forbs. It's the entire vegetation community. But this is certainly suggestive, and this may be part of what's driving the differences that we observed. So some future directions and conclusions. So release from invasive annual grass competition can increase production of woody browse and may increase the amount of forage available for mule deer and other wildlife. This aligns with the findings of other research showing positive effects of annual grass control on perennial grass production. Mule deer were photographed foraging more often in treatment plots compared to similar untreated control plots in both of those seasons. This speaks to the importance of woody browse for mule deer winter forage. And also I sort of engaged in this thought exercise where I thought about, what other management strategies might be able to achieve the same level of cheatgrass control as we observed with one application of indaziflam. And my mind immediately goes to repeated applications of imazapic or plateau. The issue there is that if you're going to, plateau it's not too hard on that perennial vegetation with 1 or maybe 2 applications. But if you're going to keep treating over and over to control that cheatgrass long term, those effects, those non-target effects, the stunting, the slight negative impacts, right, are going to start to accumulate or potentially become more evident over time. So this is really like a really great strategy for controlling your cheatgrass with minimal impacts to those established woody shrubs. And then future research should expand on this study, sort of in the same vein as what Kurt was talking about just a few minutes ago, right? We should expand on this, validate our results, look at it in different places. And it's really important to work with managers to communicate findings. So this study was not conceived in its totality when it began. It's sort of a stepwise process where the managers, particularly Jim and Joe from Boulder County, sort of started working, made some observations, started one study, observed a little bit more, thought of some new questions, added a component to the study. And so this is really a very collaborative process between managers and researchers. So some overall takeaways, increased winter forage for mule deer is a co-benefit of proactive annual grass management, which has all of these other benefits that we've been talking about for the last hour or a little bit longer, right? Things like preventing the risk of catastrophic habitat loss due to frequent wildfire. So we need to do, again, more work to quantify and communicate the benefits of effective weed management to stakeholders and the public. The other thing I'll mention is if you think back to Lisa's presentation earlier in the webinar, there was all that really cool data about annual forbs and short-lived species and increased diversity. And mule deer are a species that is going to make use of those forbs during the summer. And so we're really zeroed in on the availability of winter browse in our study, but there are lots of opportunities to continue to expand this research. The final thing I want to mention is that so often the last several years we have these very intense winters or very punctuated snow events, and we wind up in this sort of situation where we have to decide whether we're going to let a bunch of mule deer sort of perish over the winter or we're going to engage in some sort of feeding program. And I think proactive annual grass control in places that still have shrub communities that can provide forage for mule deer. This could be an alternative strategy to those winter feeding programs, right? This could alleviate a lot of those constraints. And so I think there's a lot of potential here and a lot of promise. So we're going to move into questions here. I know we're behind schedule. But you can see that's the paper we just published in Rangelands, and Rangelands actually put Hall Ranch on the cover of the October issue. So thank you for your time. Thanks to all the other speakers. Thanks to Derek, and looking forward to maybe talking a little bit more here.
Perfect. Thanks, Jake. And I think that pairs so well with Kurt's findings. And it was always surprising to me seeing some of this data that cheatgrass, even without wildfire, is able to suppress these, this overwintering, these bitterbrush, mahogany, all these sagebrush type plants. So such critical information to get out to these land managers. And I want to thank our speakers. Those were fantastic presentations. I hope this was beneficial for everybody on the call just to hear the new upcoming research out there, and we can definitely try to do something like this again as we get more, or there's more publications out there, just to get that to folks boots on the ground that are doing the management and how important management is. So we're going to switch gears to the Q&A session. If you have anything you want to put, any questions, please enter that into the chat. We'll start off. We have one for Lisa. How was the cheatgrass control in your study overall? That was probably the longest term data set that I've seen with tools like Rejuvra. So how was that control in the study?
How long was it controlled?
Yeah, there was some confusion of the over time the cheatgrass control actually decreased versus increased. So just if you could clarify just what the control looked like as the study progressed.
Yeah, let me pull that slide up. I think it was related to this data here. And it does look like in the non-treated plots, we see cheatgrass cover decreasing even in the non-treated over time. And I think what's happening here is that just in our non-treated, we have more variability in cheatgrass cover because cheatgrass really responds to the amount and timing of precipitation. So I think with this kind of decrease here, these ups and downs, is really just related to interannual variation in the precipitation. And then here with the treated plots, it looks like it is increasing a little bit over time, though statistically, these are all equivalent amounts of cover. And so I think maybe the little numerical increases you see could just be from the herbicide no longer having activity in the soil, and then some cheatgrass seeds had escaped it, and so it's coming back. But overall, I would still say, even throughout this time period, even in the non-treated plot, the lowest cover was 37%, which I don't think anybody would be really happy with their landscape having that much cheatgrass cover. So I think the herbicide impacts were really significant and over time to reduce cheatgrass cover here.
Perfect. Thanks, Lisa. Hey, while you're on, we'll get one more question on your experience with like sage grouse habitat projects. Do you have any experience with that with your research?
Yeah. So we have a study down in South Idaho that's on a ranch where there are sage grouse leks, and my colleagues are working on a publication now where they actually tracked sage grouse habitat use with video cameras in areas treated to control invasive annual grasses and not treated. And they are seeing that more sage grouse use areas that have been treated for cheatgrass control than the non-treated areas. So I think there is also, similar to what we're seeing with the mule deer habitat use, I think sage grouse also respond to treated versus non-treated areas with that reduction in invasive annual grasses.
Perfect. Thanks, Lisa. Toby, a question on kind of from the standpoint of management. What are your recommendations from the management standpoint of preserving that high quality carbon? Like these folks that are working from these multi cross boundary landscape type projects? Where should they focus their efforts?
Yeah, I guess my sense is consistently that carbon is easier to conserve than to recover. So, well, of course, some of the focus at the end of my presentation was pointing out that it is possible to recover. Some of these sites, take 30 years to recover, and so there. And what we're also seeing is that the carbon that's lost is that stable carbon, which is known to take potentially thousands to tens of thousands of years to end up in that stable carbon pool. So I guess in terms of my perspective is we should be focusing on resisting cheatgrass invasion early and often, and attempting to prevent it from dominating these communities. Because as you saw, there's a lot of variation. The overall potential is great, but on any particular site, it's still a little bit of a work in progress to identify some specific site qualities that might say, yes, this is what makes it capable of responding positively in terms of carbon to that restoration. So since there's so much variation, my general advice is I think we should be valuing the jargon term that you sometimes see is avoidant conversion, but which is sort of self-explanatory, just avoiding conversion in the first place. That being said, if you do have a way of looking at your reference communities, some of the data I was showing is kind of exciting to be able to say, okay, well, this site actually was never invaded too badly. And if the maximum invasion wasn't too intense, then that is likely to mean that it is able to recover more rapidly and more effectively. So some of those levers, like how badly was it ever invaded, kind of dovetails nicely with the conservation bit as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Toby. There was a question in the Q&A about tools for management and Rejuva in particular. As this tool, how often is this being used? Should we be looking at other tools as well? Definitely. Even our group at Enview, we're looking for other tools and tank mixes and things that we can add different modes of action to combat resistant weeds. And I think from the standpoint of Rejuva, since I've been working with that tool for over 10 years now with many of my colleagues, but we got the grazing label for that product in 2020. The use rates are 3.5 to 7 ounces per acre, so relatively low use rates, which is good. And the benefit really is one application is giving us multiple years of control. And that's really where we see resistance build up very quickly are in cropping systems where they're using the same product year in and year out, such as Roundup. It can develop resistance within a couple years if you're only using that tool. But having that longevity and control, applying one time really helps. And then I would say a majority of the applications that we're working with on a landscape scale with land managers have a combination of Rejuva with a Mazapic. That's another mode of action that you can have in the tank at the same time to work on that species to also limit resistance. So again, that's really what we're finding, that longevity to deplete the seed bank is key. And there's actually a link I posted in the chat that dives into a webinar that speaks specifically on that if you want to tune into that and get some other ideas there. But in terms of that, BLM did get the programmatic EIS done in 2024. So that is just recently being a potential tool for Western states on BLM lands. So that's an opportunity there. Let's see if any others come in. I guess from Kurt and Jake, one last thing. Was your finding, were they surprising to you in terms of the 20% threshold? Kurt, was that something that you thought even at that low of level that mule deer would be avoiding? And I guess from Jake, was there anything surprising in your study that kind of caught you off guard? And then we can wrap things up.
I can go ahead and jump in here real quick. I don't know that there's anything super surprising. The one thing I will say is that, when we were going through the review process for the manuscript, one of our reviewers pointed out that there aren't a lot of examples of cheatgrass impacting woody plants very directly in terms of their competition, right? There's sort of been this assumption that because those shrubs are going to have deeper roots and cheatgrass roots are going to sort of be restricted to, the shallow zone of the soil, that competition was fairly limited. And so, actually one of our reviewers in the review process was like, you should make a much bigger deal out of this. And so that's a very a unique experience to get from a reviewer, right? Most of the time it's the opposite. You're trying to talk up your research and point out all the things you think are important, and you sort of run into a brick wall in the review process and they're like, you need to really tone it down. But this was sort of the other way. And so that is really, I would say that is maybe not necessarily so surprising to me, but that experience made me think a little bit more explicitly about competition between those deeper rooted woody plants and cheatgrass. And so along those lines, I'm writing a proposal right now to do a tree ring study, a dendrochronology study this summer to actually pull cores from ponderosa pine trees in treated and untreated areas and see if we can actually see the effects of treatment in the growth rates of those trees. So, that's, not something super surprising. The one other thing I will say is that if you Google mule deer and you look at the images, I think roughly 30% of the images that pop up have cheatgrass, right? The mule deer is standing in a field of cheatgrass looking majestic and awesome. So maybe it's just, not just like a lack of awareness about this issue, because there seems to be a lot of overlap between mule deer and invasive annual grasses. And so maybe the response to the research and the interest in it has also been a little surprising. But with that, I'll hand it over to Kurt.
Yeah, I think Jake just summed up my thoughts pretty well, but our study system is in maybe a little less classical deer habitat that many of us think about, the high elevation, succulent forbs everywhere. And so it wasn't terribly surprising to me, given that in our system, deer are, eating a lot of shrubs and forbs when they're available. So in places where cheatgrass has taken over enough that they're outcompeting those resources that deer are primarily foraging on, then yeah, it doesn't surprise me to see some pretty heavy avoidance of those spots.
For sure. Well, thanks. I just want to thank our speakers again for presenting today, and I hope this was beneficial. There has been, I feel like, a gap between really the university research side and getting this information out to land managers, and I hope this was beneficial. We'll send the recording out, and I think that'll be it for today. So be on the lookout for that, and appreciate you guys all attending. Thanks.